Hello, I'm Chancellor Ronnie Green. Thank you for joining me for today's Nebraska Lecture. This distinguished lecture series features some of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's most notable scholars, researchers, artists, and thinkers. At Nebraska, we believe in the power of every person. For about 2 decades, the Nebraska Lectures have showcased some of Nebraska's finest scholars, people who embody the spirit of this institution and are committed to sharing their knowledge with the public. Our speakers are renowned experts in their fields. They are scholars who strive to collaborate, breaking down the barriers between disciplines. They are educators who are committed to mentoring and shaping the next generation. They are problem solvers who have spent their careers addressing some of society's most pressing challenges. I am so proud of their accomplishments and dedication to our university and the state of Nebraska. Thank you to the Office of Research and Economic Development, the university's Research Council, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and other partners for making this lecture series possible. I hope you enjoy today's Nebraska Lecture.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Wilhelm, Vice Chancellor for Research and Economic Development at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Welcome to our Spring Nebraska Lecture. This lecture series highlights some of Nebraska's finest artists, researchers, scholars, and thinkers. Today's lecture features Dr. Philip Schwadel, Carl A. Happold Professor of Sociology. Phil has researched the growth in recent decades of religious disaffiliation in our country, especially among young Americans. Religion has traditionally been an important part of Americans' identity, but as more and more people identify as non-religious, it is likely to profoundly impact the future of our society. We look forward to Phil sharing his thoughts about those impacts. Phil received his bachelor's degree in religious studies from the University of Florida and his master's and PhD in sociology from Penn State. He came to UNL in 2005 and also spent 2018 to 19 as a senior researcher in religion with the Pew Research Center. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our co-sponsors in bringing you these lectures. The Office of the Chancellor and the Research Council, as well as in collaboration with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. And please, stay tuned after the lecture for a live Q&A with Dr. Schwadel. If you have a question for Phil, please email it to unlresearch@unl.edu.
Good afternoon. It is my honor and privilege to be here delivering the Spring 2023 Nebraska Lecture. I'd like to thank Chancellor Green, Vice Chancellor for Research Wilhelm for inviting me. I'd like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences and the Sociology Department for everything they've done to help me get here, for supporting my research along the way. And I'd like to thank Professor Kristen Olson for nominating me for this prestigious honor. Now, before I get going, I want to tell you just a little bit about myself. I am a sociologist of religion. My research focuses on religion and youth, which I'll be talking about today, religion and politics, religion and social class, which will come into today's talk as well, and religion and social change, which is really the background behind a lot of what we're talking about today. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of Florida, my graduate degree from Penn State, and then I did a 2-year postdoctoral research position with the National Study of Youth and Religion. And I'll be talking more about the National Study of Youth and Religion today. And then I came to the University of Nebraska in 2005, and I've been here since. Now in today's talk, I'm going to be talking about American religion, or specifically about American non-religion in the 21st century. I'll be summarizing 2 decades of my research and other research on religion and youth in the US. This talk will be broken up into 3 parts. The first part will summarize the state of American religion. This will be relatively brief. The second part will also be relatively brief, where I'm just going to talk about what I'm referring to as the causes of religious non-affiliation or disaffiliation. And in that sense, I mean the demographic factors that lead some people to be more likely to have no religion than other people. And the bulk of the talk, the third part of the talk, will focus on what I'm calling the consequences of non-religion. In other words, how non-religious young adults differ from religious young adults and why this is important. And while I realize that the title of the talk refers to the causes and consequences of religious non-affiliation, I was a bit overly ambitious. And so the talk will mostly focus on the consequences of religious non-affiliation and disaffiliation. So to begin with, I want to address the broad question, is the United States a religious nation? It's a seemingly simplistic question. Are we religious or are we not religious? Now, to be clear, I don't mean are we a Christian nation, which I know is a popular topic of discourse. I mean, are we a religious nation in the sense that are we a religious people for the most part? Now, historically, religion has played a large role in the United States, beginning with the Great Awakening, which was a religious revival before we were the United States of America, when we were the original 13 colonies. A very emotionally charged religious revival which spread throughout the original colonies, with leaders like Jonathan Edwards, who had a lasting impact on American religion. After the founding of the U.S. in the 1790s, we had another religious revival, which we, in retrospect, refer to as the Second Great Awakening. It was not as emotionally charged as the first religious revival, but it led to the founding of key institutions, religious institutions which still exist today, many of them. Colleges and universities, seminaries, missionary societies. And so this is the early part of our history. Religion played a large role. For the next 100 and change years, from the early 1800s into the middle of the 1900s, we experienced what some researchers refer to as the Third Great Awakening, a broad period of general religiosity in our nation. Now, our research suggests that in some ways religion undoubtedly declined over the course of U.S. history, but in some ways, surprisingly, it actually increased. As work by Roger Finke and Rodney Stark, as you see on the left here of this slide, shows, their work, as well as other work in the early 1990s when they first wrote The Churching of America, this, by the way, is the second edition, which came out in the 2000s, they and other researchers were working to debunk what they referred to as the myth of past piety. This idea that we were always historically more religious than we are today. And their research shows that at least in terms of some measures of religion, institutional measures of religion, things like are you a member of a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, as you can see on the figure there, we became more religious in those ways over the course of much of U.S. history. Not in every way, but in some ways. Indeed, religion has often played a prominent role in our country. In the middle of the 20th century in particular, we saw ourselves as a highly religious nation. In the 1940s and 1950s, we had key religious leaders like Billy Graham, who traveled around the country, known as America's pastor, preaching about religion, Christianity, his specific brand of Protestantism, and not only that, but the role of religion in our nation, the connection between religion and the United States. Around the same time, in the 1950s, we saw ourselves as a religious nation in a Cold War with the atheistic and communistic USSR. Religion played such a prominent role at that time that President Eisenhower joined a church and became the first president to ever be baptized while in office. Reflecting the prominent role of religion in the 50s, we saw that the phrase, under God, was added to the Pledge of Allegiance, in 1954. Now, things began to change a little bit in the 1960s. In the 1960s, we had a civil rights movement and a women's rights movement, an anti-war movement. Not all of these things necessarily began in the 60s, but they were particularly prominent in the 60s. There was the hippie movement or flower child movement. There were new religious movements, some Christian, some non-Christian, leading to a lot of people to question whether religion was declining in our society, going away, disappearing. This is reflected by the Time magazine cover, the very famous Time magazine cover from 1966 that said, question, is God dead? Nonetheless, despite these concerns, just 10 years later, Time magazine's cover story, The New Empire of Faith, all about the rise of evangelical Protestantism in the United States. Not just the growing number of evangelical Protestants at the time, but the increasing public presence of evangelical Protestantism. And so that's where we were at the end of the 20th century. According to the International Social Survey Program in 1998, 15% of us in the United States said we had no religion. Compare this, and I'll talk more about what no religion means in just a little bit. Compare this to 27% of Australians, 32% of Canadians, more than 40% of Germans, almost half of all British or French citizens said they had no religion. We were a considerable outlier at the end of the 20th century. We were more religious than most of our peer nations. Not all. I don't want to suggest that we were by far the most religious nation. As you can see, Italy, also an outlier. Spain, which is not up on here to figure, also an outlier. Parts of Ireland, also an outlier. Nonetheless, for the most part, we were one of the most religious nations of all the advanced industrialized nations at the time. Then things began to change. Now, it really didn't just change exactly in 2001. It started to change near the end of the 20th century, as we'll see in just a little bit, in the 1990s in particular. But for the most part, we saw religion really decline in the United States in the 21st century. For example, the General Social Survey, which is the gold standard in the field. It's a repeated cross-sectional survey. It's been done since 1972. We'll look more about numbers from the General Social Survey in just a moment. But the General Social Survey, a highly reputable survey, shows that in 1998, 15% of us said that we'd be a better nation if religion had less influence. Just 23 years later, across the first 2 decades of the 21st century, this doubled. 3 in 10 of us now say we'd be a better nation if religion had less influence. Tremendous change. Most importantly, and what I'm going to focus on for the remainder of this talk, is the change in the number of Americans who report having no religion. By no religion, we mean when we ask someone on a survey, what is your religion? Is it Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, so on? The last option is none, none of the above, or nothing. Sociologists of religion tend to refer to these people as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, as contrasted with N-U-N-S, and unfortunately that is the best joke sociologists of religion have, I'm sorry to say. According to the General Social Survey, in 1972, 5% of us said we had no religion. Fast forward to 1980, 7% of us have no religion. 10 years, 1990, 8% of us. Still pretty rare to report having no religion. Most Americans still have a religion. Then things begin to change. This almost doubles in the 1990s. By the year 2000, 14% of us reported having no religion. And this skyrocketed in the 21st century. 28% of us, according to the General Social Survey, had no religion by 2021. This is a monumental change, a fundamental change in American religion and American culture more broadly. Now, given how monumental this change is, how fundamental it is to American society, it's important that we confirm the results, that we make sure that the General Social Survey is correct, even though it's a highly reputable source of data. So one of the other most highly reputable sources of data on American religion comes from Pew Research Center. And we can see that their numbers match the General Social Survey almost exactly. According to Pew, in 2007, when they started collecting reliable data on this, 16% of Americans said they had no religion. By 2021, 29%, almost identical numbers to the General Social Survey. In contrast, 78% of us were Christian in 2007, down to 63% in 2021. Tremendous changes, tremendous growth of non-religion and decline of Christianity. Further confirming these results, we can look at Gallup, one of the other most reputable sources of data on religion, I should say, pardon me. Gallup's data shows the same thing, a rise in the proportion of Americans, percentage of Americans, who have no religion. Gallup was nice enough to also break it up by generation. The top line here, the red line, is Gen Z. As you can see, Generation Z increased by far the most and is the most likely to report having no religion. And as the small print at the bottom of the figure says, later generations in particular are even more likely than Gen Z to report having no religion. They just didn't have enough of them in the first 2 periods to put them up here. In other words, non-religion is increasing dramatically and it's disproportionately being driven by young Americans. And so that's what we'll be talking about for much of today. This is where we are now. The United States is now a relatively non-religious nation, or I think it's a better way to frame it is to say a large minority of us are not religious. In 2020, according to the World Religion Database, we ranked 20th of all nations around the world in terms of the percent with no religion. We're still more religious than some of our peer nations, in Great Britain and France and so forth. But we're not as much of an outlier as we used to be. We're now a relatively non-religious nation, and this is disproportionately, like I said, driven by young people. And so that's what I'll be talking about for the rest of today. How youth and young adults are not religious, what this means for their lives, and what this means for the well-being of our nation. Now, as I said at the start, my goal was to talk about the causes and consequences of religious non-affiliation or religious disaffiliation. I realized as I worked on this that this was a little overly ambitious. Summarizing 20 or more years of research into an hour is hard to do. And so I'm going to briefly summarize what I'm talking about as the causes, of religious non-affiliation. In other words, the demographic differences between those who are and are not religious among young adults in the United States. Before I do that, I want to talk about the data. The data for the rest of this project come from the National Study of Youth and Religion. Like I said, I worked for the National Study of Youth and Religion for 2 years when I was a postdoc before I came to the University of Nebraska. The National Study of Youth and Religion began in 2002 and 2003. It's the first longitudinal study of adolescent religion in the United States. It's the first survey to focus on adolescents and follow them over time and to be specifically focused on their religion. It began, like I said, in 2002 and 2003 with a nationally representative sample of 3,370 adolescents, and we also surveyed one of each of their parents in order to learn a little more about their background, their family life, and so on. We followed these young people over time. The final wave was 10 to 11 years later when they were 23 to 28 years old. And so we could see changes in religion from adolescence to young adulthood. You could see that the National Study of Youth and Religion data has produced many books and reports about adolescent and young adult religion over the last 20 years. In fact, most of the really reliable research on changes in religion among youth in the United States comes from these data. And like I said, I was a postdoctoral researcher with the National Study of Youth and Religion. I largely helped them to do face-to-face interviews and to design the second wave of the survey. So let's start with the first and most basic question: how many adolescents and young adults are not religious? When we surveyed them the first time, when they were 13 to 17 years old, 17% said they had no religion, far higher than the historical average. Historically, adolescents and children are less likely than the adults in the United States to report having no religion. We know that parents tend to be religious, and they tend to raise their children as religious. When people are not religious, usually because they leave after adolescence, So this is a very high proportion already reporting no religion in adolescence. We could think of these people as basically being raised with no religion. When we surveyed them 10 to 11 years later, 35% said they had no religion. By the time they're young adults, more than a third of them have no religion. Tremendous change. This 1/3 of young adults, more than 1/3 who have no religion, is composed of about 1/3 who are consistently non-religious. In other words, they had no religion in adolescence and they continued to have no religion in young adulthood. The other 2/3 of young adults who have no religion, 24% of all young adults, are those who disaffiliated. In other words, they had a religion in adolescence and they left by young adulthood. Historically, this is the way almost everyone who was non-religious became non-religious. They left. But increasingly, we're seeing people being raised with no religion. Indeed, 1/3 of these young adults who have no religion had no religion since adolescence, possibly ever in their lives. So, we have an idea of what the number of young Americans is, percentage is, who have no religion. Who are these young adults and adolescents who have no religion? Like I said, I'm going to talk about the causes of non-religion, demographically speaking. And I'm going to summarize this research relatively briefly because I want to focus on the second part of the question, the second question here, the consequences of non-religion. So which young adults are non-religious? Demographically, who's more likely to have no religion? Let's start by talking about gender. There's a large body of research on religion and gender. Women tend to be more religious than men, especially in Christian nations. Research points to various reasons for this. Women are more risk-averse than men. Women are socialized to focus more on religion than men. Women are expected to be the caretakers disproportionately, which leads them to focus more on religion, and so on. And indeed, this is what we see among these young adults and adolescents. In adolescence, boys are considerably more likely than girls to already report having no religion. Among those who had a religion in adolescence, boys are much more likely to leave as well, to disaffiliate. So consequently, by the time they're 23 to 28 years old, by the time they're young adults, about 41% of young men have no religion, compared to only 30% of young women. Big gender difference. Race and ethnicity plays a role as well. Again, there's a large body of research on how religion is related to race and ethnicity in the United States. In particular, we know that on average, African Americans tend to be more religious than other Americans. Researchers sometimes refer to the church as a, quote, semi-involuntary institution in the black community because it plays such a prominent role in that community. Everyone has some sort of connection to it. It's semi-involuntary. And that's what we see among these young adults. We don't really see it in adolescents. There's no racial differences in who reports having no religion in adolescence. However, in terms of who disaffiliates and then has no religion by young adulthood, we see big racial differences. By the time they're young adults, white, Latino, and other race young adults are more than twice as likely as young African American men and women to report having no religion. Large racial and ethnic differences. Region also plays a role. We often think of the Southeast as a relatively religious part of the country, or at least conservatively religious part of the country. We call it the Bible Belt, colloquially speaking. Historically, the West has always been the least religious part of our country. Even before the West was not actually on the Pacific coast, the frontier, wherever it was, as our country expanded, was always the least religious part, And that's what we see with these young adults and adolescents. And adolescents, those in the South, are less likely to be raised without a religion. And those in the West are more likely to be raised with no religion. And as they grow older into young adulthood, these differences grow. By the time they're young adults, those in the West are far more likely than those in the rest of the country to report no religion. And those in the South are at least moderately less likely than those in the rest of the country. The next area of research that we know influences religion is household structure. Whether a parent is married or not, whether they're cohabiting or not, or whether they're a single parent, influences their child's religion. We know from a large body of research. And we see this with these adolescents and young adults too. In adolescents, those who live in single-parent households are far more likely to say they have no religion. And this difference only grows over time. In other words, growing up in a single-parent household has a lasting impact. Even those who had a religion in adolescence are more likely to leave religion by the time they're young adults if they grew up in a single-parent household. So consequently, by the time they're young adults, those who grew up in single-parent households are far more likely to have no religion. Now, the final area I want to talk about is education. There's a popular notion in our society that education is what we call a faith killer, is detrimental to religion. Politicians, religious leaders, cultural leaders of all sorts refer to the ways that higher education, particularly secular higher education, such as we're doing here at the university, leads to religious decline. From a large body of research, starting with my dissertation, which focused on the effects of education on religion, we know this isn't necessarily true. Highly educated people tend to be religious in some ways, but they tend to be more religious in other ways, particularly in terms of institutional forms of religion. Highly educated Americans are more likely to be a member of a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple than less educated Americans. They're more likely to attend religious services. They're more likely to volunteer for a religious cause. And indeed, we see that plays out with these young adults. So firstly, the expectation that those who grow up in a home with a parent with a college education would be different does not pan out. Whether parents have a college education or not plays no role in whether an adolescent reports having no religious affiliation. However, a young adult's education themselves does matter. Whether someone earns a bachelor's degree between adolescence and young adulthood affects whether they leave religion or not, but in the opposite direction as we normally talk about. Young adults who earned a bachelor's degree are less likely to drop out of religion than young adults who did not earn a bachelor's degree. So, to summarize, demographically, non-religious young adults tend to be male, white, Latino, or other race, not African American. Those without a college education those who grew up in a single-parent home and those in the western part of this country. Why does that matter? It matters because, as we're about to see, the non-religious differ from religious in important ways. And these demographic differences are part of that. And it's also important that as we discuss the issues around non-religion, we know who these non-religious young adults are. Now, for the remainder of the talk, I want to focus on how non-religious young adults differ from religious young adults, what I refer to as the consequences of non-religion. I'm going to address this in several ways. I'm going to talk about things like marriage, children, and sex, health and well-being, friendships, morals, values, and politics. And throughout it all, I'm going to emphasize how non-religious young adults differ from religious young adults, and not just why this is important for them, but why it matters for our nation. So to begin with, health and well-being. There's a large body of research showing that religion is strongly related to health and well-being. I've done some of this work with Professor Christina Fauci in the Sociology department here at the University of Nebraska, where we look at the kinds of churches Nebraskans attend and how often they attend, and how this is related to different mental health outcomes. Other work I've done with Pew Research Center looks at how religion is related to happiness and health around the world. Broadly speaking, our research shows that religious people tend to be happier, tend to be healthier. They have better mental health outcomes, better physical health outcomes. They're less likely to participate in detrimental health behaviors that are problematic for people's health. And we see the same thing among these young adults. So starting off with mental health, we asked them a series of questions. Have you been bothered by these two things in the last week? As you could see, non-religious young adults are more likely to say they felt down, depressed, hopeless. They're considerably more likely to say they felt little interest or pleasure in doing things. They're moderately more likely, but significantly, to say they felt bad about themselves or that they were a failure. And this applies to other measures of mental health as well. Looking at a broad measure of overall health, we also see that non-religious young Americans are less likely to say that their overall health is excellent or very good. They're more likely to say their overall health is poor or not very good. Now, this might seem like a broad measure. What does this tell us? That my overall health is very good or excellent. You may see excellent as differently than I see excellent. Nonetheless, our research shows that this measure is highly correlated with objective measures of health. People who say that their overall health is very good or excellent are less likely to have heart disease, high blood pressure, all kinds of objective health problems, diabetes, and so on. So this is actually a pretty good measure. And as you can see, non-religious young adults, relatively young people, 23 to 28 years old, are already reporting considerably worse health than religious young adults. So why does this matter? Well, this of course matters to them. We all want to be happy. We all want to be healthy. I'm pushing the big 5-0. I think about health a lot every day. We all want to feel good, but it's also important for our society. We've seen an increase in depression in the United States. In the years leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, according to the White House, the US White House, the number of adolescents who experienced at least one major depressive symptom in the last year increased by 90%. The number of young adults who experienced a depressive symptom in the last year increased by 80%. That was before the pandemic. Our anecdotal evidence suggests that these problems have become worse since the pandemic. At the same time, suicide rates among young adults and youth increased by 47%. We have what our federal government refers to as a mental health crisis in this country. We're less happy than we used to be. We're experiencing more depressive symptoms than we used to be. And these findings indicate that this is particularly a problem for non-religious young adults. So in other words, non-religious young adults may be contributing to this broader problem we're having. We see more non-religious people, more non-religious young adults in particular, and we're having increasing problems with depression. And non-religious young adults are particularly likely to have mental health problems. Now, to be clear, I'm not blaming non-religious young adults. In fact, the rest of the country has some of the blame. When we look at the mental health of non-religious Americans, we note that part of the reason they have worse mental health is because they're stigmatized. Because we as a nation tend to look down on them. We tend to see them as different, lesser than. there's a large body of research about how Americans look down on people they consider to be non-religious. I've done some of this research myself, looking at what we call political tolerance. Do you think various kinds of people should be able to have the same rights, political rights as other people? And our research shows that Americans are, many of them, likely to say that non-religious people don't deserve the same rights. Serious problem. And as this research shows, this stigmatization of non-religious Americans has negative repercussions for their mental health. A good part of the reason why non-religious Americans, and particularly non-religious young adults I'm emphasizing here, have worse mental health is because we treat them differently, because we portray them differently, because we talk about them differently. Now, it isn't just their physical health and their mental health, it's also their health behaviors. Alcohol, for example, which is particularly problematic for physical health and mental health. Non-religious young adults are more likely to consume alcohol. They're more likely to consume alcohol weekly. More than half of them say they drink alcohol every week, compared to 40% of religious young adults. I didn't put the binge drinking numbers up here, but they follow the same trend. Non-religious young adults are more likely, than religious young adults to binge drink, often defined as 4 or more drinks in a single sitting for a woman, 5 or more drinks in a single sitting for a man. It's not just alcohol, it's also other problematic health behaviors, other drugs, illicit and legal. Non-religious young adults are more likely to use prescription medications for non-medical uses. They're twice as likely as religious young adults to say they've used hard drugs, cocaine, crack, heroin, LSD, PCP, and ecstasy. They're far more likely to say they've used marijuana or pot, and they're far more likely to have smoked cigarettes. This affects the well-being of these non-religious young adults. They're more likely to be unhealthy, at least partially, because they do all of these things. But it also affects our society. Alcohol use is a problem in our country. Excessive alcohol use is responsible for more than 140,000 deaths in the U.S. in the years leading up to the pandemic. More than 140,000 deaths per year, in the years leading up to the pandemic. Costing our country more than $250 billion per year. And our anecdotal evidence suggests that alcohol problems became worse during the pandemic, at least during the first year and a half of the pandemic. We also see that leading up to the pandemic, overdose deaths were increased in the United States from drugs. And again, anecdotal evidence suggests that this has gotten worse during the pandemic. At the same time, we've seen life expectancy decrease in the United States. From 2019 to 2021, the average life expectancy declined from 79 years to 76 years. Now, of course, COVID-19, the pandemic, had something to do with this. But as researchers from Harvard conclude, to quote them, that's the largest decrease over a 2-year span since the 1920s. COVID-19 drug overdoses and accidental injury, account for about 2/3 of the decline in life expectancy. In other words, it's not just COVID. It's also drugs, and it's also alcohol. So what do we see so far? Non-religious young adults are not as healthy. They have worse mental health outcomes, worse physical health outcomes. They're also more likely to participate in unhealthy lifestyle behaviors, which is problematic not only for them, but for our nation. The next area I want to talk about is children, marriage, and sexual behaviors. There's a large body of research on this as well. We know that religious and non-religious Americans approach family formation, marriage, children differently. Religious Americans tend to focus more on marriage and especially children. They're more likely to get married, and they're more likely to have children. And when they have children, they have more children on average. We also know that religion is related to sexual behaviors. Religious people, and particularly conservative religious people, tend to view sex differently and sometimes behave differently, sexually speaking. However, I do want to emphasize that the sexual behaviors of conservative religious Americans aren't necessarily as different from the rest of us as we might think. As the work of Kelsey Burke in the Sociology department shows, in many ways, conservative religious Americans have sexual behaviors that aren't that different from Americans. Nonetheless, we know that marriage, children, and sex are related to religion. And indeed, we see this among these young adults. By the time they're 23 to 28 years old, already almost 3 in 10 religious young adults are married, compared to less than 2 in 10 non-religious young adults. A large difference in marital rates at this stage of life course already, which is likely to continue as they grow older. This is a concern not only for them if marriage matters for their lives. For many people, it's an important life goal. It's a stage of life they look forward to. It's perhaps the start of adulthood in some people's view. But it also reflects a broader trend in our society. Marriage rates have declined considerably. Particularly from the 1950s and 1980s, we often saw this as the result of higher divorce rates, but that's not the case anymore. Divorce has actually stabilized or declined after the 1980s. Instead, we're now choosing to not get married. We're living in unpartnered relationships or cohabiting relationships. We're living by ourselves, or we're living with someone who we're not married to. And this has affected our society. This means we have more single-parent households. This has led to some family instability more broadly. And so the higher rates of non-marital relationships among non-religious young adults may be a concern, more broadly speaking, not just for them, but also for our country. We also see they differ in terms of their children, their likelihood of having children, Already at this young age, of course, many of them will have children later on. They're only 23 to 28 years old right now. But already we see that 77% of non-religious young adults say they have no children, compared to 67% of religious young adults. And when religious young adults have children, they have more children than non-religious young adults as well. Large differences in not only the prevalence of children, but the number of children. Why is this important? Because this also reflects a broader trend in our society. We've had a tremendous decline in birth rates in the United States. Holding migration steady, we are now well below replacement level, as demographers refer to it as. In other words, we are not having nearly enough children to replace our population. This is a concern. Our economy relies on the expansion of our population. Our ability to compete in the international marketplace requires our population to at least maintain a certain level, if not to grow. And instead we see that our population is declining. We're now well below replacement level. And as we have more and more non-religious people who are less likely to have children, this is a serious concern. We're heading towards the kind of situation we see in Japan, where they don't have anywhere near enough working age people for a retired person. And in fact, we're already seeing those issues here in the United States with not enough people to staff our jobs. Another area where they differ here is in their sexual behaviors. So we talked about marriage, we talked about children, now I want to talk about sex. At young adulthood, 23 to 28 years old, we see already that there are large differences in sexual behaviors. Non-religious young adults, on average, have sexual intercourse for the first time at 17.0 years of age, compared to 17.5 for religious young adults. This may not seem like a big difference, half a year, but half a year is a huge difference at this stage of the life course. And it has important implications for risky sexual behaviors later in the life course. We also see that non-religious young adults have, on average, 1.5 more sexual partners than religious young adults in their lifetime. Another problem. Why is this concern that non-religious young adults have sex at a younger age, have more sexual partners? It's a concern because these are risk factors. Our research clearly shows that people who have sex at a younger age, on average, are more likely to contract sexually transmitted diseases, sexually transmitted infections, to experience unwanted pregnancy, and to have other negative outcomes associated with health. Those who have sex at an earlier age are also more likely to have more partners, and both sex at an early age and more partners are both positively associated with risk factors, the same risk factors. STDs, STIs, unwanted pregnancy, other negative outcomes associated with sexual behaviors. So this is a concern that non-religious young Americans have more sexual partners, have sex at a younger age. Of course, it doesn't mean that everyone who has sex at a younger age, who has more sexual partners, contracts an STD or experiences unwanted pregnancy, but it increases the risk. And non-religious young Americans are at greater risk. So, summarizing, so far we've seen that non-religious young Americans are less healthy. They're more likely to report worse mental health outcomes and to take part in risky health behaviors. They're less likely to be married, less likely to have children, have sex at a younger age, and have more sexual partners. We also see they differ in terms of their friendships. I've done some work on religion and adolescent friendships in particular with Professor Jacob Cheadle, former member of the Sociology department here at UNL, who's now at University of Texas at Austin. In our work, we look at students in schools. And we use these data where we survey everyone in the school. And so we know the religious leanings, religious interests, religious backgrounds of all the students in the school. And we follow them over time. And what we found is that adolescents, when they're choosing new friends in school, tend to choose students who are relatively religiously similar to them, at least compared to the average student in their school. Moreover, over time, they tend to become more religiously similar to their friends. Consequently, their social networks, their friendship networks, become more religiously homogeneous over time. As time moves on, they're interacting with more and more people who tend to be like them religiously speaking. And this is what we see with the young adults in the National Study of Youth and Religion. We asked them a series of questions about their 5 closest friends. We asked them about each of these closest friends. Are they this way? Are they that way? Are they this way? Are they that way? So forth. For 5 different friends. Non-religious young adults, 43% of non-religious young adults report that none of their 5 closest friends are religious. The exact same percentage, 43% of religious young adults report that 3 or more of their 5 closest friends are religious. They're interacting with very different social groups and not interacting with each other. And this applies to other attributes of their social networks, of their friendship networks as well. Attributes that are associated with religion and non-religion that we've already talked about today. So for example, we talked about how non-religious young adults are more likely to drink alcohol. Non-religious young adults are also considerably more likely to report that at least some of their closest friends excessively drink alcohol. Most religious young adults tell us that none of their close friends drink alcohol. We also saw that non-religious young adults are considerably less likely to be married. We saw the same thing with the friendship networks. The majority of non-religious young adults tell us none of their 5 closest friends are married. The majority of religious young adults tell us that at least some of their 5 closest friends are married. They're interacting with tremendously different people and not interacting with each other. This reflects a broader trend we've seen in our society. Non-religious and religious young adults have very different friendship networks, but so do we more broadly in our country. We refer to this as homophily, sociologists. This literally means love of sameness. Work by Miller McPherson and Lynn Smith-Levin and their colleagues over the last few decades have shown that over the last few decades in the United States, our social networks have become more homogeneous. In other words, we're less likely to interact, to have friends with people who are different from us. We're the green people, or the yellow people, or the red people, and we don't interact across these social networks very much. This is important because our research shows that this kind of social isolation, only interacting with people who are like you, is problematic. It's bad for our society, and it's bad for individuals. Having connections across segmented or segregated social networks is beneficial. Researchers refer to this as weak ties or bridging ties, connections across tight-knit social groups. These kinds of connections are pivotal. They provide information, resources, access to knowledge people wouldn't otherwise have. And we're increasingly lacking this in our country. And the growth of non-religion appears to be contributing to it, as non-religious young adults interact primarily with other non-religious young adults, and religious young adults interact primarily with other religious young adults, who also share their other attributes with them. So, to summarize so far, we've seen that non-religion is strongly related to health and well-being, marriage, children, sexual behaviors, and who someone interacts with, who their friends are. The next area I want to talk about is values and morals. Over the last few years, I've been doing research with an interdisciplinary team of psychologists and sociologists. We've been looking at how religion is related to morals and values. Values, what do people value in their lives? What do they think is important? Morals are related but not identical concept. It's more about what do you think is good or bad, right and wrong in our society. Now, we've been doing research on how religious and non-religious Americans, youth and adults, differ in their morals and values, and especially how leaving religion influences people's morals and values. And indeed, we find that religious and non-religious Americans differ considerably in their morals and values. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not arguing that one group is moral and the other is not. It's that they base their morals on different attributes, on different things that they think are important in defining what is right and what is wrong, what is good, what is bad, what we should value in our lives. And we see this with these young adults. So to start off with values, we asked them, do you strongly or moderately agree with these things? Non-religious young adults are far less likely to say, I'm proud of my country's history. All children need to respect authority. People should not do disgusting things even when no one is harmed. People should be loyal to family even when they've done wrong. And men and women have different roles in society. Now, to be clear, there are no differences in other values. We asked them, when the government makes laws, the number one principle should be ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. No difference between the religious and non-religious. We asked them, when one of the worst things, a person can do is hurt a defenseless animal. No difference between the religious and non-religious. But it's these things where they differ. Nationalism, respect for authority, disgust and purity play a key role. Family and tradition, and especially tradition around gender roles and marriage. This is what the broader body of research and a lot of the research I've been doing with this interdisciplinary team shows. We see the same kinds of things with their morals. We ask them, when deciding what is right and wrong, is the following at least somewhat important? Non-religious young adults are far less likely to say showing love of country, showing lack of respect for authority, violating standards of purity and decency, conforming to traditions of society, and did something disgusting are important when deciding what's right and wrong. Again, it's a lot of these same things. Nationalism, authority, purity, decency, disgust, traditions, and so on. I want to make clear there are other morals where they don't differ. We asked, when deciding what's right or wrong, when deciding what's right or wrong, does it matter if someone suffered emotionally? The religious and non-religious are equally likely to say that matters. Whether someone treated people differently than others, the religious and non-religious are equally likely to say that. Whether someone acted unfairly, the religious and the non-religious are equally likely to say that. But it's these issues where they differ. So broadly speaking, we see that the non-religious and the religious differ in their morals and values. This is of course important to their lives. It's important that it affects what they think is important, what they value, what they see as right and wrong in our country. But it also reflects a broader trend we've seen in our country. Increasing culture wars. Culture wars are often seen as beginning around the issue of abortion, but growing to include other issues. Transgender rights, LGBTQ rights more broadly, gun rights, the role of religion in the public square in general. And this has become a particularly problematic issue in the United States. We've seen a lot of conflict around these culture wars. As the figure here suggests, we are one of the culture war capitals of the world. And religion is key to culture wars. Not only religion, but the morals and values that differ between religious and non-religious people are core to our culture wars. So broadly speaking, we've seen that non-religion is among young adults related to health and well-being, marriage, children, sexual behaviors, friendship networks, interacting with very different people, and morals and values. And of course, these things aren't unrelated to one another, as I'll talk about in just a few moments. The final area I want to talk about is politics, when it's related to the culture wars we just talked about. We see a large body of research on how religion is related to people's politics. Religious people, different religious groups behave differently, politically speaking. They view political issues differently. Moreover, the religious and non-religious differ politically speaking, as you can see from some of the research I've done on the politics of religious nuns, as we call them, and specifically on the politics of non-religious young Americans. We know that non-religious Americans tend to be less participatory, They tend to lean specific ways in terms of their political orientations. And they also tend to emphasize specific issues. Most prominently, we see that there are differences when it comes to the environment, as some of my work has shown, and as some of my colleagues in the Department of Sociology here at the University of Nebraska's work has shown in their views of LGBTQ laws. So how does this play out among non-religious young Americans? Well, firstly, there are big differences in voting. Among eligible voters in these young adults, the non-religious are considerably less likely to vote. And it isn't just that they're less likely to vote, they're less likely to participate in electoral politics more broadly. They're less likely to contact a campaign official, to work for a campaign, and so on. Why is this important? It's important because we have low levels of political participation in the United States. As political scientists and political research more broadly has shown, democracies function best when more people participate. We can go back to the work of Alex de Tocqueville, who the better part of 200 years ago was impressed by the participatory level of the American population. That's what he marveled at, how we all were participating locally, at the state level, and nationally in politics. But in the second half of the 20th century, this changed. Political participation declined tremendously. At the end of the 20th century, we had one of the lowest voter turnout rates of any advanced industrialized nation. Now, things changed a little bit in the 21st century. We've seen an uptick in voting rates, but we still lag behind our peer nations. And the fact that non-religious Americans are more likely to not vote, to not take part in politics, they're a growing portion of our population, is concerning for the health of our democracy. We also see they're different in their political orientation and parties, as I already mentioned. This comes from a question we asked them, are you extremely liberal to extremely conservative? 1 to 7. Now, not many Americans put themselves at the ends. And so you might look at this gap and say, that's not that large. But in fact, it is very large. This is larger than the gap between most demographic groups. If we compare two given racial or ethnic groups, they don't differ this much. Men and women don't differ this much. This is a big difference. We often hear about how evangelical Protestants are more religious, more conservative, than other Americans, politically speaking. This difference between religious Americans and non-religious young adults is larger than that difference. The point here is that religious young adults tend to be relatively conservative, and non-religious young adults are moderate to just slightly left of center. And this is reflected in their party affiliation as well. Religious young adults are more than 3 times more likely to affiliate with the Republican Party than non-religious young adults. Instead, non-religious young adults are moderately more likely to be Democratic and considerably more likely to be independent or to affiliate with another party, such as the Green or Libertarian parties. This applies to their policy preferences as well. We asked them the top two most important challenges for our country. As you can see here, religious young adults tend to say healthcare reform, abortion, unemployment, and illegal immigration more often than non-religious young adults. These are the policies that are important to them. These are the challenges they see facing our nation. Conversely, non-religious young adults are more likely to say the environment, income inequality, access to education. These are the issues that non-religious young adults see as most important. And particularly big difference we see, as I already mentioned, when it comes to same-sex marriage, laws around LGBTQ Americans more broadly. The vast majority of non-religious Americans, young adults, say same-sex marriage should be legal, while only about half of religious young adults say so. So the non-religious and the religious differ politically. This reflects a broader trend in our society. We've seen growing political polarization. Increasingly over the last few decades, more Americans, Democrats and Republicans, see conflict between the parties. More concerning, increasingly, we're likely to see the people from the other party as closed-minded, dishonest, immoral, lazy, and unintelligent. This is a real concern. We're seeing considerable political polarization and conflict in our country. Now, I didn't want to talk about political polarization and conflict. This is not what I wanted to get up here in my one chance to talk to the entire university body and talk about. I wanted to talk about more positive things. But unfortunately, 2 decades of research on youth and young adult religion has led me to this point. This is where there's differences are leading. And it's reflected in the results we've talked about today. They have different morals and values, contributing to these broader differences in politics, religion, and culture wars. They have different political perspectives, contributing to this as well. Moreover, this is reinforced by the fact that they interact with different people. They're not talking to each other. They're not interacting with each other. We, as a nation, are living in echo chambers. These young adults are either interacting with liberal, non-religious, people who are just like them, who are not married, drink sometimes, things like that, or religious, married, conservative. We're separating. This is a problem. So I began to talk with asking, are we a religious nation? And as I worked through this talk over the last few months, I should say, as I synthesized all the research, I realized that's the wrong question. That's not what I should have been asking. I should have been asking, how can we accommodate both religion and non-religion? That's what we need to do. It isn't about whether we're a religious nation. 3 in 10 and growing of us say we're not religious. That's the reality. So instead of asking, are we a religious nation, I want to ask, what can we do to help address these issues? What can we do to help accommodate religion and non-religion? To help non-religious young adults be productive members of our society. And so I want to end by talking about that. What can we do to accommodate non-religion? What can we do to change things? I will focus on two things. Firstly, we could destigmatize non-religion. Some of these problems we've talked about have to come from the fact that we treat non-religious people differently. We depict them differently in our popular culture. Many Americans think of them as lesser than, not worthy. They shouldn't have the same rights, and so on. We need to promote greater connections across social divides, across divided groups. There's a model for this. There's a camp called Seeds of Peace. I wanted to wear my Seeds of Peace t-shirt, but I didn't think it was appropriate for this venue. Seeds of Peace is an organization that brings together Muslim and Jewish youth from Israel and Palestine to go to a summer camp in the United States every summer. They interact with each other, they get to know each other, and hopefully see each other as humans. And as they mature, as they get older, the hope is that it will help alleviate some of the conflict there. We can do the same thing here. We can be intentional. We can create programs to have religious and non-religious young Americans interact with each other to promote these kinds of connections. The other suggestion I want to make is to create institutions to help non-religious Americans. I've talked a lot about the research about how religion is beneficial. Religious people tend to be happier, they tend to be healthier, they're less likely to participate in risky sexual behaviors. All of these kinds of pro-social outcomes associated with religion. But most of these positive effects of religion come from the religious community. They're not so much due to the fact that people have religious beliefs, a theology, a connection with the divine, or a feeling of closeness to God. Those things can play a role, but the research clearly shows that most of the beneficial effects of religion come from the community. Not just the church, mosque, synagogue, temple community. Yes, that community is important, but also the broader community around it. It provides social support. It provides people to talk to, people to help with, people to babysit. Did you just give birth? People bring you food. Are you down on your luck? People donate money. People donate clothing. Do you need a job? Hey, this guy heard about a job. Do you need access to some place to learn how to do a new job? This guy could tell you about that. Communities are important. Connections are important. And the religious benefits that we're talking about here today largely come from the community, from the social support, from the connections people have. They confer health benefits. They create systems of family support. What can we do about this for non-religious Americans? Actually, here there's a model too. Secular congregations. This is relatively popular in Western Europe. It's really rare here in the United States. The biggest organization is called Sunday Assemblies. Now remember, non-religion began in Western Europe sooner than it did here in the United States, and it increased a lot more rapidly. And so to replace the loss of community, they've started to build what they call secular congregations. They operate a lot like churches. They don't focus on the divine, on the otherworldly, on God, but they do a lot of the same things. They meet in a big gathering on Sunday. They meet in smaller face-to-face gatherings throughout the week. They provide the same kind of community support, systems of support that churches provide for their members. They have clothing drives, food drives, all these kinds of things. Most importantly, our research shows that it works. Sunday people, Western Europeans who are non-religious, who participate in Sunday assembly congregations, have better outcomes than non-religious Western Europeans who don't participate in them. Moreover, it benefits their communities as well. And this research shows it's not beneficial in the same way being in a book club or a soccer club or a knitting group is. It's beneficial in a lot of the same ways belonging to a church is. And so that's where I want to end. I want to end on this positive note that we can do something. It's been a lot of doom and gloom here today, how non-religious young adults differ from religious young adults and the kinds of ways this is causing problems for our country. But there are things we can do about it. We can help create greater connections between the religious and non-religious. We can help build institutions that help replace what non-religious Americans lost by not participating in churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples. I'll end it there. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure and my honor to deliver the Nebraska Lecture.
Well, Phil, congratulations on a wonderful Nebraska Lecture on a very timely topic for us, and in summarizing your work in this area. It's an honor to be selected to give a Nebraska Lecture for the university, and congratulations on a wonderful lecture. Yeah, we want to talk a little bit. We had some questions come in during the live stream of the lecture that will provoke some more thinking maybe, and so looking forward to that conversation. You know, just start kind of really pretty generally here. You probably can't do this and say there is this cause or there is this specific thing that you can draw a cause and effect to, but you know, how would you respond to you think the cause is of growing non-religion?
That's a great question, and it's one that there's obviously a large body of research on. Most of the research sees it as sort of a continual action and backlash kind of process. So in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, we saw the politicization of religion in a lot of ways, especially the politicization of evangelical Protestantism. And the research suggested a lot of people who were sort of identified with religion, predominantly Christianity, but were tangentially religious. You know, they didn't really attend very often. It wasn't that important in their life. It wasn't something that really they thought about a lot. A lot of those people are the ones who left. They were turned off by the politicization of religion, by the connection between religion and certain cultural issues in our society, where religion used to be more of a private aspect of our lives. And so the research suggests that that led to a growth of non-religion in the 90s and early 2000s, and that as well had an impact. That led to some of the backlash among conservative Christians who then didn't like the growth of non-religion. So we see this sort of back and forth process.
So there, I guess I'm trying to find the word cyclicity, right? There might be some cyclicity to retreats from religious affiliation or retreats from practice of religious affiliation. If you go back over longer periods of history, as you pointed out, we've long been seen as a country, a religious country out in the world. But there have been ebbs and flows in that historically too, right? As you point out. So what is there likelihood, or do you see any likelihood that there would be a ebb and flow of a return to more religion or more religious affiliation?
No, that's a very interesting question. It's a very timely one. So I was just asked this morning to review a Pew Research Center report on modeling the future of religion in the United States. And that's a tough question. So broadly, the research suggests that this growth in non-religion we're seeing is likely to level off. It won't probably still continue at the same rate it has happened at over the last 2 decades, as I showed in this talk, the tremendous increase over the 90s and early 2000s. So odds are it will level off. Will it return? Really, there's no suggestion that we'll see a return to religion. But we don't expect this continual increase in non-religion. Particularly, there's various reasons. So we could point to well, firstly, like I said, is a lot of the people who were not very religious in the first place who left, and many of those people have already left, so they're gone in terms of being religious. Moreover, religious people on average have more children, and most people who migrate to the United States are religious. So odds are it will level off in the near future. But will it return? That's yeah,
it's a new level.
Yes, odds are it won't return, honestly.
Yeah, and there's a I don't want to say I've phrased this the right way. There's religious affiliation and practice through religious affiliation in a whole variety of ways, right? Depending upon that religious affiliation, and there's spirituality, right? So is there any work that talks about that? The difference between those that would identify as religious or affiliated religiously versus spirituality. Right. That makes sense?
Absolutely, and that's a great question, honestly. That's one that's behind a lot of this research, is that this is about institutional religion. This is about people identifying, like you said, as Christian or Muslim or Jewish, affiliating and attending as well, the churches and mosques, synagogues and temples. However, just because people leave organized religion, just because people no longer identify as Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, so on, doesn't mean they're not religious. And that's why I think that's such an important question. You know, it's hard to put an exact number on all these kinds of things, but on average, in most of our surveys, when these people who say they have no religion, about half of them or so say they have beliefs we would certainly see as religious. So they may not believe in the God of the Bible as Christians and Jews see that, but many of them believe in a higher power, for example. Many of them pray. So I think that's a great question, and a lot of them see themselves as spiritual. Really, in this talk, in this research, I was looking at institutional religion.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that beliefs are going away.
Right, right. So this one gets to more, I guess, institutional belonging, if I use that term. I think most work would show that there is a decrease in desire to be part of institutions or institutional belonging in all kinds of forms of that. How much is that tied up with this disaffiliation, if you want to think about it that way, or decrease in religious affiliation? Right.
It is. What you were talking about there, the decline in broader participation in our society is been well established. Probably the most prominent researcher in that field would be Barbara Putnam with his work on bowling alone, on how we we used to bowl in bowling leagues, and now when we bowl, it's just me. And he gave a talk here 10, 12 years ago. It was a really great talk. And indeed, the broader decline of participation in our society and institutions is reflected in this broader decline in religion. But the decline in religion, I think, is qualitatively different in a sense that it isn't just that people don't want to participate in these institutions anymore. There's something that's driving at least a large minority of Americans away from it. While yes, I do think it's part of this broader trend of us no longer being as participatory as we used to be, I do think it's also moderately different. It's not exactly the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think there's other processes that have been driving it besides the broader decline of participation.
Right. And you talked in your lecture about a lot around the youth. I'll use that term broadly, right? The younger generations disaffiliation or becoming non-religious in practice. So is it only an issue in the young, or is it demographically across generations? That was certainly something that prompted my interest as well.
Right. It's disproportionately among younger people. We have seen non-religion grow among middle-aged and older people too. The portion of Americans, I should say, who are in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s who have no religion is solidly higher than it was 30 years ago. But much of this trend has been, basically the result of younger people leaving religion. And really, when most people, even historically, even before the current generation or two I've been focusing on this talk, historically when people left religion, it was usually in the earlier stages of life. Most people don't leave in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. Not that it never happens, but when people leave, they usually leave in their late teens, 20s, or early 30s. That's generally the time of disaffiliation.
This may be kind of a crazy question, but it came in for some question about, well, has the advent of the internet and the digital age, right, has that had an impact on disaffiliation from religion or becoming less religious?
That's a really interesting question. It's not one I really thought about coming into this talk. Certainly the internet has changed our culture in ways that are beyond my expertise to talk about, but in ways that might be relevant to a broader decline in religion. But I don't think that the fact that people have access to the internet or can watch, say, religious sermons on the internet, all those kinds of things, have really led to a decline in religion. In fact, it's been a strength in some ways about keeping people connected in ways they couldn't have been otherwise. So while the cultural changes associated with the internet, and particularly I think political polarization and broader conflict associated with the internet might play a role in our declining religion, the mechanics of people having access to the internet I don't think really does. And as I talked about in the lecture, it began before really the advent of the internet. Not literally, but at least before most of us had easy access to it. It started in the 1990s.
Right.
When at least I didn't have access to at least the late 1990s.
Yeah. Yeah, and then there's this getting your head wrapped around too of belief, right? Religious belief or belief in a higher power. So the agnosticism versus being religious versus agnosticism is saying that you are non-religious mean that you don't necessarily believe in it? You understand my question?
Absolutely, and that's related to one of the other questions, and not at all. Saying I have no religion does not mean I am an atheist.
Right.
In fact, the majority of people who say they have no religion do not identify as atheists, and when we ask them, do you believe in God, or at least if we define it as including something like a higher power,
right.
Many of them do.
Right.
So it's not equating, we shouldn't equate having no religion to being an atheist or even being an agnostic. So, as I mentioned, we're looking at 3 in 10 or so of Americans now say they have no religion. Only about 5% of us identify as atheists. So there's clearly a large number of non-religious Americans who don't see themselves as atheists.
Right, right. And then there's also and you brought this up in your lecture in a couple of different places. There also is the fragmentation, if you want to think of it that way, of the differentiation within religious, whether it's forms of religion or belief systems or denominations within, that kind of thing as well,
right.
where there's differentiation even across the political spectrum, right? And so you talked about the evangelical right in Christianity versus, there's even wide differences there that have evolved over time as well. Would you say that's the case also?
Absolutely. So, if we look at the average church, say 40, 50 years ago, there was going to be a lot more diversity in people's political positions and social positions and cultural perspectives. Today, we see that most churches are relatively homogeneous, much more so than they used to be. There was always some aspect of homogeneity, and it depends on what factors we're talking about. As I mentioned, our churches have always been, or at least for a long time, have been racially largely homogeneous, but they become more ideologically homogeneous over time.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's the indirect. That's kind of what I was getting at, I think.
Yes. No, they absolutely have. But part of it is because many people who are ideologically different left the church.
Right.
And so when you have a subtraction of the people who are different, then it makes the people who are still there more homogeneous.
Right, right. So there's a couple of, these are more, I guess, practical questions that have come in that we'll explore too. So within the realm of pastors, right? So this question is, what role do you see for pastors in this postmodern divide? And what does that mean? I guess I'll admit I have a personal interest in this because I have a child who is a pastor. So, any comments there?
Absolutely. So I mean, religious leaders have a large role here, and it's a hard time to be a religious leader, honestly. In fact, we're really expanding our research on religious leaders as we're seeing that they have things like mental health problems due to a lot of our conflict we're seeing today. That a lot of the conflicts they see in their churches even are wearing on them. But absolutely, religious leaders have a role here in helping to bridge some of these divides. And a lot of them are doing their best, but it's a tightrope. It's a hard line to walk where they have to make sure that they don't ostracize the people who are in their church while they try to attract people who have left or have never been there.
And this one is one that came in online that maybe is looking for a cause and effect. So just curious about your thoughts here. Do you think that there could be any connection between families who have kids in club sports, which have activities on weekends? So thinking about traditional religious practice in many respects, and thus don't attend church, to the kids then feeling disconnected from religion. That's kind of a down in the weeds practical kind of question, but curious of your thoughts there.
Actually, I think it's a great question. And it actually there's a lot of research on time commitments going to church. There has been for a long time, even before we saw this tremendous growth in the number of Americans who claim have no religion. This was often a concern that people's other obligations, activities would detract them, would conflict with their time with their ability to go to church, especially people with children who have more commitments. And our research does suggest that that does cause a conflict, that other time commitments do lead people to sometimes not attend. I haven't really seen anyone definitively show that these kinds of time commitments lead people to leave religion. But the way the question was framed is really interesting, and I haven't really thought about it that way, is that as a lot more parents have less time to go to church, their children are attending less, and maybe that sort of has a cumulative effect on them. And so I think I want to thank that questioner, and I'm going to look into that.
I mean, it's a kind of a logical, like I use the word practice question, right? That as society changes and societal norms change, because I can remember growing up in the 1970s in the rural South, where it was taboo, right? Societally, it was taboo to have activities on Sundays. Right, include blue laws and the whole thing about whether you could even operate businesses on Sundays. And so that has changed tremendously, in terms of social practice, right? And, so it is kind of an interesting question, I think, to ask that.
No, the role of religion in our society is, I mean, even my time living here in Nebraska, I've lived here for less than 2 decades, and our laws around what you could do on Sunday have changed.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Let's see, we have time for one more question, I think, Phil.
Okay.
There's a lot of discussion, and you had in part of your lecture, talk about the political polarization that is out there and how some of that may be around, tendencies of religious affiliation or not. There certainly are camps of belief that religion plays no part in politics, right? Or that we operate in a freedom of church and state kind of culture and government environment. But you have any thoughts there around whether religion should be entering the political sphere or not?
Well, I mean, that's a controversial question.
Sure it is.
And indeed, I think that genie's out of the bottle, if you want to put it that way. Religion has entered the political sphere. There's no real taking that back, as far as I would see it. Sort of along the lines of where I ended my talk, saying, the best question I don't think was, are we a religious nation? Is how can we accommodate both religion and non-religion? Because that's the fact of our life. And I do think that religion playing a role in politics is, at least for the foreseeable future, a fact of our life. And so we have to find a way to alleviate the conflicts around that. And I tried to end on a positive note, talking about some of the ways we can help do that. But that's my real concern, is that we're seeing a lot of conflict over these issues, and we have to find ways to, as a country, see each other as Americans and as valued members of our society. Right.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Schwadel, for a great Nebraska lecture, and again on a very timely topic. Thanks for all of your work in this area and great work in this area, and for what you do at the University of Nebraska as well.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's been my honor to do this.